Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back. I'm Emily, and I've got Emily Matchar with us today. Thanks so much for those that are able to join. I'm going to do a quick bio on Emily. Emily, did I say your last name right?
Matchar. Yep,
Matchar.
you're good.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm a hard A kind of person. So Emily Matchar, it was an American journalist and author, originally from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She graduated from Harvard University in 2004. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Republic, Gourmet, and Outside, among others. Her nonfiction book, Homeward Bound, was a critical exploration of domestic influence or culture. It was published by Simon & Schuster in 2013 and received favorable reviews from the New Yorker, the New Republic, the Washington Post, among others. She was made numerous appearances on TV and radio, including The Colbert Report, Good Morning America, and made NBC's The Cycle, NPR, and BBC. Her debut novel, The Shadows of Greenbrier, was published by Putnam and Penguin Random House in 2024. And today, we are going to be talking about her new book that released April 14th, The Lost Girl of Craven County. Emily, I am so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
Absolutely. I was just telling her in the green room when I posted this book to Facebook in the New Bern local page, it got so much traction and so many comments. And so we are going to look to try to have her come out to Craven County for a book signing. So I will connect with her after this and try to make that happen. So thank you to everyone that commented and were excited about this podcast. And thanks to everybody that asked about having her actually come to Craven County and do some book signings and some interviews. We would love to see that come to fruition. Emily, I love this book. I read it. I didn't want to read it too far in advance because I wanted it to be fresh on my noggin for this podcast, but I have read it over the course of the past 72 hours. It was a really quick read, but it was really good. And I was telling you in kind of our green room area, you write really well. It was very reminiscent from a descriptive perspective. Ray Bradbury, where my daughter and I, we homeschool, we are reading Fahrenheit 451 right now. And the way that he writes and kind of pulls the author in right at the start with that hook, I felt very much the same way. And similarly with Where the Crawdads Sing, for those in North Carolina that have grown up or live in the marshes, Where the Crawdads Sing is written around this area, and the way that Delia Owens describes the things and the smells and the heat, and you kind of feel like you're there while you're actively reading. And I really enjoyed that, meeting Millie and Cecilia in an area that was geographically familiar to me, being in Craven County myself. So can you tell us a little bit about your North Carolina upgrade? You're in Indiana right now, but you grew up in North Carolina. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I grew up in, I lived in Durham from the time I was a baby until 14, and then we moved to Chapel Hill. So I went to high school in Chapel Hill. I did a year and a half at UNC Chapel Hill and then transferred. And then when I was done with college, I moved back to Chapel Hill, lived in Carborough, which is a little town adjacent to Chapel Hill, through most of my 20s, met my husband when he was in grad school at UNC. And then we wound up moving to Hong Kong for 10 years,
Oh, wow.
which is a very different place, but also a hot place.
Yeah.
So I'm like, the heat, like all the Lost Girl of Craven County takes place in August. So like there's just, heat, heat, heat. And of course, this is a time pre-air conditioning. So, well, of course, I've always had air conditioning. I've lived most of my life in hot places. And yes, like you said, I'm in Indiana at the moment. My husband teaches at Purdue, so we're here in a much colder place than I'm used to. And we've been here for almost 4 years, and I'm still not used to the winter. So I really appreciate your noticing my descriptions of heat in that sort of muggy North Carolina heat, because I am very familiar with that.
Yeah. You went to Harvard. What did you study at Harvard?
English. I was
Okay.
an English major, which, wasn't a very thought out choice. It was more of a, I like to read. So if I do English, I'll just get to read a lot, which, was basically true.
Yeah.
So I did English, and I also, I did, it wasn't a minor, but like I did a focus in creative writing. And for my senior honors thesis, I wrote a book of short stories because I was, I always liked to write fiction and saw myself as, wanting to be a fiction writer. So I did that. But then when I graduated, I had really uh like Millie, I was at a bit of a loose end and didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't, I wanted to be a novelist, but, how do you go from being a college student to like being a novelist as a job? And I needed to make money. So I went into journalism,
Okay.
which, this being 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago, was still a slightly viable career for an English major. And I wound up working for a while at the newspaper in my hometown, and then wound up freelancing for different magazines and newspapers for many years. And it wasn't until I was, approaching 40 that I sat down and said, you know what, like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to actually write a book, start to finish, a novel. I've always wanted to, and I'm just going to try it. I'm not going to focus right now on like whether it'll ever get published. I just want to write it. I just want to write it start to finish and start there.
That's awesome. Well, you can definitely tell you were an English major. So, so let's talk about some of the themes in Homeward Bound. I did do some research on these. I've not read them, but they are actively in my TBR list. But it talks about the domesticity of women, and then in the Shadow of Greenbrier, we talk about family trauma, secrets, which definitely transcends this new book, The Lost Girl of Craven County. Why are these themes like growing up and kind of breaking free of pre-existing conditions or pasts that were put on as children and kind of growing into those? Why are those themes important to you? They tend to kind of transcend all of your books as like an undercurrent.
Mm-mm. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I so my first novel, In the Shadow of the Greenbrier, it's set in and around the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, which is a real
Mhm.
place. I don't know if you've ever been there.
I have not, but I watched a podcast that you did earlier this week talking about the Greenbrier, so it's on
Yeah,
my list.
it's such an interesting place. And I mean, the genesis of that book was that when I was a newspaper reporter, like I said, in North Carolina in my early 20s, me and another reporter that we were friends, we just decided to take a random weekend road trip. And we went up to West Virginia because she wanted to see something there. And we were just kind of driving around. And one night in the hotel, I was, Googling like what else there was to see before, we headed back to North Carolina. And I read about the Greenbrier and the bunker tour you can do. And so we went and we took a tour of this, it was the underneath the Greenbrier, there's this, well, I don't want to spoil it too much.
Don't.
uh, there's a secret facility. I mean, it's part of history.
Okay.
It's probably some people know about it. There's this secret facility, secret government facility. I won't tell you what it was for, but it was built underneath the Greenbrier during the Cold War, and everybody in town, the tour guide on that tour of the Greenbrier was explaining to us that she had grown up in this small town, White Sulphur Springs, where the Greenbrier is, during the Cold War, and they were building something under the Greenbrier, and everybody knew it wasn't just a basement. That's what they said. It was just a basement, but everyone knew that wasn't true. And she said, but we all understood that it was a secret we were meant to keep. And
Oh.
they did. And I thought that was so interesting, the idea of a town keeping a secret. So I
Yeah.
think I've always been interested in the way, secrets work in families and in culture. And so that book grew from that fact, that historical fact. Okay, what if a town all had a secret that they kept together, and like how that might interplay with the secrets that a family keeps throughout the generations, and how that kind of reverberates. And we've got, I've got some similar themes in The Lost Girl of Craven County. And I think you asked about like family expectations and how that affects my characters, which is also definitely a theme. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that I write Jewish characters, Jewish families growing up in the South. I grew up Jewish and in Durham and Chapel Hill, which are, bigger towns with larger Jewish communities. And I grew up in the 90s where, cultural expectations were different. But because I write these characters that have, the same expectations that any characters have, anyone has growing up in a family, plus these expectations of, carrying on this very particular cultural tradition that is maybe not the mainstream cultural tradition where they're growing up. There's like this additional pressure. So not just that you have to get married, but that you have to marry a Jewish husband, which might be a pretty hard thing to find, in, say, small town West Virginia.
Or Craven County.
Or Craven County, even though there was a sizable Jewish population in New Bern. It was still a challenge. So my characters are wading through, how to weigh tradition and history and family expectations against their own desires. Yeah.
You brought up a couple things that are other questions that I have for you. One of them was, why Craven County? Have you come to Craven County before? You knew so many things, and I want to talk a little bit about that. The way that the city was laid out from the Swiss back in the early 1700s in the shape of a cross, the fire of 1922 on December 1st that took out 40 blocks of New Bern. And that's a big exhibit in our fire museum here in downtown New Bern. But the streets are familiar. You had a very solid grasp on Middle Street and Craven Street and all. Like, I could see myself walking down the street, and where the Pepsi place is today, oh, that used to likely have been this other, place in the book. And tell me a little bit about how you did the research, or kind of have come here to be able to put that so solidly on a page.
Well, I'm so pleased, because like there's nothing better than hearing from like a real local that you got like the vibe of the place. Right.
I could see myself walking down to the bridge that swings out with the train. I mean, it was being there, and I read that. So I was telling her in the green room, we've been in Hawaii for several months for a work assignment. And I read this coming back home, but I could see, I could literally feel myself walking down the street and seeing the marsh and walking to the railroad tracks. And it was uncanny not having been here for several months and now feeling like you were thrown back in there on the airplane coming back already.
Okay. Well, I'm so glad. I love New Bern. I've been to New Bern lots of times. But a lot of the historical details that wound up in the book weren't necessarily things I knew just from visiting. So there were things I learned once I decided to set the book in New Bern, which I did for some, like, I knew I wanted to set it in a small town in North Carolina. I wanted to set it in a small town that I was familiar with. And I wanted to set it near the water for some reasons that are sort of logistical, that have to do with some of this stuff that gets revealed in the second half of the book, which I won't spoil in case people haven't read the book and want to enjoy the twist that comes about midway through. I knew it needed to be like in this particular, it needed to be in this particular region of North Carolina. And so New Bern was an obvious choice. And then when I learned about the Jewish community that existed in New Bern during the period where the book is set, the book's set in the 30s, and there was a sizable Jewish population, through, I think, mid-century-ish. That's now
Mhm.
smaller. But when I learned about that, I was like, okay, well, this is just perfect. So all the stuff that you mentioned, like the fire in the 20s, I hadn't known about that until I started to do research. I hadn't known, a lot of the details that I put in. Like I knew stuff, like that Pepsi was invented in New Bern. I
Yes.
knew, a lot of the basic stuff, but I didn't know the deeper history. I didn't know about like, you know, it being laid out in a cross by the Swiss. It
Yes.
was a detail that I learned and I liked. So, I read a whole bunch of history stuff. I mean, fortunately, like New Bern's got a great historical society and they've got a lot of materials that were
Yes.
super useful. The synagogue, I think maybe it was the Friends of the Synagogue. There's a beautiful old synagogue, as you know,
Mhm.
in New Bern. They had published something. It was like a walk through, Little Jerusalem, where they
Yes.
they had sort of like a walking tour of what it would have been like to walk through the shops of Middle Street, back when the Jewish community was thriving, and that was super useful for me. But I'll also say I did a ton of just like Google Street View when I was writing and I wasn't actually in New Bern, but I wanted to be like, okay, if I'm like walking in this direction, like what do I see and where's that building? I would like walk through Google Street View to just kind of get it right since I couldn't write the whole book I wasn't physically
Yeah.
in New Bern for the whole writing.
Yeah.
And that was very useful. So I'm glad you feel like it really took you to the
Oh,
place.
for sure. And it caused me being someone, so my family, for those that are listening that don't know me, I was born and raised in North Carolina. I grew up in Monroe, North Carolina, which is right outside of Charlotte. My husband's from Asheville. We've lived mountains, Piedmont, coastal plains, and we've been in New Bern now about 5 years. It was 5 years in March. And there were so many things at the beginning of this book I didn't know about the Jewish community and kind of the proliferation. But you caused me, and I told you this in the green room, like I'm not someone that reads between the lines when I'm reading for a book. You have to really kind of put it in my face if you want me to pick up what you're putting down. And it caused me to want to go do research. And it's likely because I live here now. And I was like, oh, I wonder if that's a real thing or if this is part of the fictional component of the book. But going back and learning about how the Jewish really settled here was from the death of two young boys in the 1800s, I believe it was when I was reading. And they didn't have a Jewish cemetery to bury them in. And so needing to basically it was out of need that they started to settle here. And it started from the death of these two young boys here in Craven, what it was New Bern. So it was really interesting to read. And then about the church that was, created and for a place for them to gather. So it was really interesting to read. Similarly with the fire, I have been to the Firemen's Museum. Of course, I have young kids and they love the fire trucks. And so we have been there, but I didn't reading about it in the book because you kind of mention it quickly, but it had such a huge impact on Craven County. And going back and reading some first person accounts that have been written since by the New Bern Historical Society on folks that actually were living and likely children then, but what their perspective was and how it devastated this area. It really kind of brought in a 1930s perspective, kind of what these folks were still really recovering from, because you talk about it from the perspective of they're still kind of building New Bern and there are things happening and changing in the setting. And so it just caused me to want to ask a lot of questions to try to figure it out, which was really nice. So I learned a lot about where I live, which is great.
Oh, I'm glad.
And I hope others will do the same, especially if they have young kids and they live here, like to go out and do the research
Yeah,
and have the
this
kids kind of
town
walk
with
it.
such interesting history.
Yeah, for sure. And being a coastal town where folks were likely coming in from all over at one point, being a port town, like there's a lot of
Mhm.
history here for sure. Were there any parts of this story that in the writing process you consider, like you wrote and thought, well, this isn't necessarily pertinent to the story, but it was a big chunk of your writing, or something that as you were writing, you were like, I really need to fill in the gap here, and kind of went back in the editing process and added? Where I'm getting more into the technical of kind of writing a novel, but I would love to know if, given kind of some of the remote research that you did and the virtual walks through our town, if there were pieces that kind of came and went as you were writing and editing.
Yeah, definitely. When I write, I have like two documents or three. I've got, the draft that's open, and then I've got like my historical research document where I've written notes like about, all the factual stuff, to refer to. And then I've got like a document that's open for the cuts.
Mhm.
So, as I'm writing, I'll look and I'll go, okay, like that needs to go, and I'll move it into the cuts document. And then I keep it like instead of, deleting it, because sometimes I then go back and need to
Sure.
move it back. So at the end, when I'm done, I those cut documents are sometimes as long as the book itself.
Oh,
Um, so sometimes, yeah, it turns out like I've written twice as much as I've actually kept. And that's just, like you said, it has to do with, well, maybe something's interesting to me as I'm writing and I write a lot about it. And then I go back and I go, okay, like that's interesting, but it's maybe not super relevant to the plot. So I can't keep it, or I can't keep most of it. And and then I have to cut it. And then sometimes, I can sneak back in a sentence or two, but I'm always cutting. And that's, and then when it goes to my editor, she then will have comments about what needs to be cut as well. So I'll do more cuts at that point.
sure. So speaking of cutting, what was the, or things that may be painful, but like in this book, and I don't want to do spoilers here. I do want folks to go read this. This is such a good book, and especially if you are from Craven County or have been here a lot on vacation, it's you will find yourself in 1930s Craven County whenever you read this. So I hope folks will go read it. And I don't want to do any big spoilers, but I'm curious if there is a scene in this book, especially between Millie and Cecilia, that was harder. Like, what was the hardest scene for you to write? I can tell you what was hardest for me to. I read the book and I listened to it on Audible, and the narrator on Audible is really great.
Yeah.
It was, and I love the accents that she did to kind of break the characters up. But what was the hardest scene for you to kind of write?
That's such a good question. Gosh, the hardest scene for me to write, I think there's some scenes at the end where Millie is talking with her mom, who she's had, who she loves and who loves
Mhm.
her, but she's had a hard relationship with. So Millie, she's 25, she's unmarried. Her mother desperately wants to get her married. Her mom raised her as a single mom because Millie's dad died when she was
Mhm.
young. Millie had two brothers, one of whom got her beloved younger brother, Augie, had gotten sick and died
Yeah.
some years before, which really, threw her life off track. Um, and she's always kind of felt like maybe her mother hasn't grieved Augie the way she thinks she should have. And so she's having like, at the end of the book, she's having this sort of conversation with her mother where they're trying to, understand each other's perspective. And it's sort of, they're talking about Augie, and it's quite sad. And I think that was hard for me to write. I have a rule, like, when I wrote my first book, I was like, okay, rule is like no children die in the book. And in this book, like Augie, who's not a child, but a young man, I mean, maybe 18, 17 or 18, so
Sure.
sort of a child, has died, but it was in the past. So it's like, it's already happened.
Mhm.
But it was very sad. And that was, I think, probably a hard scene for me to write just because it was so emotional.
I got my hair done yesterday, and please don't judge this because this is not how she styled it. The hair is not my thing. But we had a whole conversation. She is also a voracious reader like myself. And we had a whole conversation yesterday sitting in the chair about how there are books that we really liked until we got to the point and we were like, just take the kids out. Like, don't do that to the, you know what I'm saying? And so that's so funny that you mentioned that because I literally had that conversation.
That's
Yeah.
so funny. Totally. I mean, me and my husband will like be watching TV, like a detective show, and I'll be like, oh no, like I think there's going to be like a child who died plot, like the detectives like, well, and I am like, no, I don't, I don't want to watch this anymore.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Um, So Millie and Cecilia, and I say Cecilia for those that are going to read the book, she has a different name. Whenever she's found earlier in the book, she is given a different name because she does not speak, but she can. And I find that so in the middle of the book when she spoke for the first time, it like jerked me back. I was kind of I was on the train, right? I was riding the train and I had like, and when she spoke, it kind of, wait, it took me on a whole different path. I had a renewed energy to get through the next like couple of chapters. But they're friends, right? And kind of this uncanny friendship that they create. But they is there one character between the two that you identify with more or that you enjoyed writing more between Cecilia and Millie?
So yeah, so for anyone who hasn't read it, Millie is the main protagonist, who is this young woman, from a Jewish family in New Bern during the Depression, and her family owns a pickle factory, and
Mhm.
which is actually that's a real thing. There was a Jewish-owned
There
pickle
was
factory.
a pickle factory here. I read all about
Yeah,
it. The Oringer, yeah.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. So Millie one day she goes out to run an errand at the pickle factory, and she finds this young woman like seemingly unconscious behind the pickle barrels outside the pickle factory, and the woman doesn't seem to speak, and she can't say what her name is, and so Millie takes her home and decides that she's going to help figure out like who she is and where she needs to go. um I will say I did identify, and then you do in the second half. It's revealed, her name and the young woman's identity and where she's come from and her whole background. I identified very much with Millie. I will say, I identified with Millie as she's 25, she's not married, she's feeling quite lost in life. She'd gone to college, but hadn't graduated. She'd wanted to be a journalist, but it hadn't happened. She's, living at home and feeling, very adrift and pathetic, and feels like everybody thinks that she's, pathetic and crazy. And ooh, I did identify with that pretty hard. I definitely had a period after college where I had no idea like what I was doing, or um, you know, how I was going to get a real job. And I was like working in a Japanese restaurant and living with my parents. And I felt super, super pathetic. Like everybody I went to college with, it seemed to me, had a great job in New York and was living like an amazing life. That's what it felt like to me
Mhm, of
at the
course.
time. And here, I'm like very much adrift and, working this restaurant job and living at home and not knowing like how I'm going to get on the career ladder or anything. I I very much felt that in common with Millie.
Yeah. I too, and I was telling you this, so growing up in Monroe, very small town as well, and in the high school that I was in, I felt very much the same way, especially whenever we graduated. And some folks went on to have families straight away. I went to college, got on a path where that doesn't even exist today. Like I graduated with something I can't even use. And so I definitely identified with feeling kind of this rush from the parental point of view of needing to find your way quickly. And now my 47-year-old self looks back and wishes I had been more graceful with myself. And like I found myself being very empathetic towards Millie, like, Millie, it's going to be okay.
Yeah,
There's a whole lot of life after 25.
right, right.
So just hang on, girl.
Yeah, I feel the same.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I too think, from a secrets perspective we were talking about earlier, I felt in hindsight, right, whenever you reflect on the book after you close the last page, up until the point where Cecilia kind of enters the chat in a very literal way, it was almost as if you were keeping a secret. I mean, you have a whole half a book where you as the author had the perspective of knowing this is coming. And I found kind of that undercurrent of secrets that Millie is keeping and kind of this internal struggle that she had with Augie and other things that she's working through. And then reading some of the kind of recaps and listening to your podcast about the Shadow of Greenbrier, I felt very much like you put yourself into that secret realm. And like, this is something that I have that you're going to get to learn later. I thought, and this may not have been intentional, but I found it interesting, kind of you keeping a secret through a half of an entire book before you let us, the reader, in on it. Was really interesting in hindsight.
Yeah. Thank you. I definitely, it's a challenge to sort of, something and that it's going to be revealed, but you can't, reveal it yet, and knowing like when the right time is. And I will say, like, a longer period in my initial draft. There was a much longer period before the identity of the woman is revealed as Cecilia. And my editor was like, "Oh, we need to get there faster. We need to get to the reveal faster." So I did. I edited it. So we got there faster than in the initial draft.
Nice. Well, I'm going to start to wrap us up here. And again, for those that are listening that are living in and around Craven County, we are going to try to get her here. So I'm going to do some follow-ups after this and try to get her to come in for some in-person stuff. So, but what is one thing, I know you've done some book tours. I saw on your website that you've gone out and done some in-person stuff around this Lost Girl of Craven County. But what's one thing that you hope readers get from this book? If it's not something we talked about already.
I think what you were saying about, when you're looking at Millie's character and you're like, give yourself some grace, girl. Like, if anyone's reading this who is younger, I feel like there was a way that this book was speaking to my younger self and going like, look, there are so many ways things can work out. And like this idea that it's all over at, 25 or 30 or 35 or whatever. And, like I said, I didn't write my first novel. Like, it didn't come out until I was 41. So it's, like, there is no one thing your life's going to be. And yeah, to do like, like what we wish Millie could be doing and give yourself some grace. I think that's, one of the messages of the book. So I would say that's a takeaway.
I love that.
I hope any younger reader or not younger reader takes away.
No, whenever I have the opportunity, like I said, my kids are young and we homeschool, and I have the opportunity to tell them, like, we're learning certain things, right, that are fundamental to just basic life skills. But at the same time, even teaching them, I go back and I learn things in a different way that I'm like, I wish I'd have known this back then, because your context is different and your history up till this point is different, or the use of that skill, right, is different. And so telling them like this math equation is going to mean nothing to you or something very different to you once you've had some practical application of it, or this reading, like there are books that I read as a child, like in middle school, my daughter's age, that I've gone back and reread, like Fahrenheit 451, for example. And it's a whole different perspective reading it as an adult from when I was a child. So I love that. What's one question about the book that you've not been asked yet, but that you really wish someone would ask you?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Or just a question I haven't asked, but that you have been asked that you felt was a good question.
Well, I don't know if anyone has actually asked me this, but it's something I sometimes talk about, which is why I said it the time period. I
Oh,
set it
okay.
in because, as a historical fiction writer, like that's always, the
Sure.
important question when you sit down to write something, like what time period and why this time period. And, you know, I said it at the tail end of the Depression. And the reason for that was that, well, I didn't want it to be a World War II book because that's its
Hmm.
whole thing, with like Jewish characters. I mean, with any characters, you have to deal with the war and its aftermath. And that wasn't what I
Sure.
wanted this to be about. But I wanted it, I think Millie, in many ways, she feels to me like when she sort of came to me, she felt like a modern woman in a lot of ways, like obviously living with the expectations of, her time. But I knew I wasn't going to set it, like way back because I wanted her to, have some fairly modern expectations for her life, like having a career that maybe, a woman wouldn't have had in, say,
Sure.
1850. Um, and then this book is, it's in a large part, it's about like what, helping strangers and like what makes somebody reach out and help a total stranger and why someone would do that. And what I'd learned about the Depression probably in school was that it was such a hard time for people to survive, that a lot of people just really, reached across and helped their neighbors and even helped total strangers. There's a a thread in the book where Millie's brother Augie had been very interested in helping like the hobos,
Sure.
the young boys that had turned up in New Bern, like just, off the trains looking for work. And he had made it his mission to give them food. And he'd also, used his camera to take their pictures. And Millie has tried to continue that, like in his honor, in his memory. And I loved that. So I thought I could connect like the theme of, the Depression and, and helping the stranger to Millie's specific case of helping the
Sure.
stranger. So that's why I ended setting it up and setting it in the 30s instead of, I could have done the 20s or something like a little bit
Sure.
earlier. I could have done later, but
And I love the symbolism that they use, the using the chalk to write symbols of like this house is not friendly to hobos, or this house you can get food here, and using the chalk, something that is very easily in a Carolina storm washed away with the rain and can just be refreshed, right? But there's also that kind of secret undercurrent, if you will, of like I know something you don't know, because these symbols that you're just seeing as you walk down the street are actually a story for somebody. They're a path for somebody else to take that's not transparent to you. You know what I'm saying? That's not visible to you. That kind of resonated with me. And I think about all of the different imagery, and now we have all of the beautiful um, big murals that folks do on buildings. But as you walk down Middle Street and kind of the old cemetery at the church and things like that, it definitely, I really just, it kind of burned into my memory, the symbolism and kind of carving a path for somebody that didn't have one, right? Hobos and things like that, but that gave them a place to go and warnings and things like that to be on the lookout for without actually having to spell it out or have a actual conversation with someone that someone else could overhear. That was
yeah.
really, I love that.
Oh, thank you.
Last two questions. What advice would you have? And we've talked about this a little bit in the green room, but would you have for an aspiring author or
Mm.
someone that is wanting to write a book, whether they're in high school today and have a thought already, or if there's somebody in their 40s, what would you have?
Yeah. I think, everybody says this, but it's true. Like you got to read a lot. So, just read widely and, and follow like what do you like really love to read, because that's, I think, going to lead you to what you love to write.
Mm-hmm.
And another piece of advice, which, isn't mine, but was something I heard from another writer. We talked about this, yeah, in the green
Mm-hmm.
room, is just about, making it a practice, a daily practice. This I'd seen before I started writing my first book, I'd seen a piece of advice from a writer that I like. And she had said, if you write 500 words a day, 4 days a week, and edit on the fifth day, in a year, you'll have a book. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, that seems manageable. Like, because I'd always thought like I needed to write a lot more. But what I realized was that I just needed to be consistent. I needed to pick an amount that I could do every day. Because, when I would try to write like 1,000 words or 1,500 words, I could do it some days, but then I'd get burned out and then I would, not write at all, on the next day. And I just, I needed a consistent practice. So for me, that turned out to actually be really, really key, is just picking an amount that I could do every day and just doing it every single day, every single weekday,
Sure, yes. Well, and you, like me, have two young boys, right? So there's no lack of interruptions in your day or things that were unexpected that you have to kind of insert yourself into at any given moment. So I love that, just kind of getting a paragraph or two out, just something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, exactly.
Last question. Are there any new writing projects that you're working on that we can be on the lookout for in the future?
Well, I'm very happy to say yes. It's always hard when the answer is no. So I have two books that are under contract. So one's going to come out next spring, and the other one will come out the spring of 2028. The one that's coming out next year is going to be it is a World War II book, and it toggles between World War II, the Eastern Front, and the Soviet Union, and 1970s Baltimore, which is the city where I was actually born. And it follows, it's the story of this all-female flying regiment in World War II. These women, this all-woman regiment where they flew, these night bombing missions throughout the war in these tiny biplanes. And they were so scary to the Nazis, they became known as the Night Witches. So it's the story of the Night Witches, and seeing the protagonist is the only Jewish member of the Night Witches, the real person whose name was Polina Gelman. And they flew these incredibly brave, insanely daring missions for years, and many of them were killed. So that's the main part of the story. And then the other time frame is 1970s Baltimore, where we have a female character who's the daughter of Holocaust survivors, who's dreaming of being a pilot at a time when women were just being accepted as pilots for commercial airlines in the United States. So it's toggling between those two timelines, and my more modern character is learning the story of the Night Witches and being inspired by it. So that'll be out next spring, and it's called The Night Witches. Nice. And then my next project is actually, it doesn't have an official title yet, but it's set in Western North Carolina in Watauga County, so outside of Boone. And it's in the decade following the Civil War. It follows a young woman in the mountains who gathers herbs and sells them for a living. And she meets a young Jewish botanist from Charleston, and you can imagine what happens. I think it's very and fun. So that as yet untitled Western North Carolina project will be out in spring 2028.
Love that. Well, I will be putting ticklers on my calendar to be able to look out for those, because that's very exciting. I love anything kind of World War II-esque, unbroken, and like the Tattooist of Auschwitz, which, talks a lot about the Jewish community. I love those kinds of things. And then, being from North Carolina, I'm sure those of us that are going to love, if you have not read it yet, The Lost Girl of Craven County. It is out. I did stop by Books A Million, and it's there. I have not been downtown. I just got back on Saturday, but I have not been downtown yet. But you can get this book anywhere where books are sold. I feel pretty confident in saying that. But you are going to love it, and then I'm sure that you'll look for it or love the book that's coming out about Western North Carolina. So, and Charleston, those are all areas that are very familiar to us. Yeah. So thank you so much, Emily, for taking the time to talk to me. I love this book. It was unexpected. A friend of mine in Texas actually reached out and saw it on Goodreads and said, "Aren't you from here?" And I was like, "Yeah, I am from, that's where I live." So I was so glad to get it and read it. And it's so good. And again, if you're not somebody that has the time or the bandwidth to sit down and read a tangible book, the audiobook is also really well. I just finished it yesterday, and the narrator is really good in that book as well. So get it anywhere you can. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. And just a quick shout out to anyone
Sure.
watching or listening. If you have a book group and you want me to come in and talk to your book group by Zoom, like I love to do that, drop in for half an hour and answer questions, talk about history, whatever. Hit me up. My website's emilymatchar.com, and I've got a form on there that you can fill out, like a contact form. So, we can make it happen. Anyway,
It's very easy. That's how we set this up.
yes.
So, and I'll put a
Yes.
link to it in the description on both of the YouTube channels. So again, it'll be on the Fairfield Harbor Podcast YouTube channel, and it'll be on Home and Hustle. And so in the description, after we get off this live stream, I'll make sure that I link through to your form, Emily.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much. And we will talk soon. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for your time. Have a good week. Bye.